Okay.
How's that? Yeah, in the back? Yes?
Awesome. Cool. Thank you. All right. I actually had an answer for that question about the favorite dinosaur, but I think I might get into trouble if I tell you. I was going to say enterprise architects, but yeah. All right. That's the only joke for today for my talk. All right. So as mentioned, my name's Neha, and I'm a product owner. I started many years ago as a developer. I was really, really bad, really didn't enjoy it, so I moved very quickly into a business analyst role. And over the years, I've sort of moved into other producty type roles, like I've been a delivery manager, I've been a product owner, product manager, and I've worked in various industries. So just so I have a sense of what your exposure is in working with product people, can you put your hand up if you have in your team? Okay, all right, so maybe a third of people. And put your hands up if you have no idea who a product owner or a product manager is. Okay, cool. Well, basically, if I had to describe what my role is, I'd say that my primary responsibility is to make sure that my team is focused on solving the right problem. So we all build solutions, but we need to make sure that those solutions are solving the right problem. So that's my main responsibility, to get us focused on the problem. And once we think we've solved it, again, my responsibility is to make sure that we actually did solve it. So get the evidence to make sure that we're happy that we solved the problem. So product thinking is basically about solving problems. And we all solve problems on a daily basis, right? We solve problems in our personal lives, like you had to figure out how you were going to get here to the expert talks today. We solve problems in our work life as well. And what I quite like is this particular definition for what a problem is, where a problem is a question. It's just a question that's raised for inquiry, consideration, or solution. So, as I mentioned, you were probably asking yourself this morning, how am I going to get to the Novotel in time? That was a problem, and you managed to solve the problem by either catching a bus or by walking, or if you were like me and you were super lazy, you just came down a couple of stairs and you ended up here. Another way of looking at a problem is it's basically a need that hasn't been met. So you had a need to get here in time. For those colleagues who were out last night getting drunk, they had a need when they woke up this morning of getting here without thinking too hard about how they were going to get here. So you could have called an Uber, could have called an Ola, but the main point is that they had a need, and you meet that need and therefore solve that problem. So once we know that we have a problem and we know that we want to solve this problem, we tend to solve our problems by either using products or services, right? So most of us work on a product or a service. Even if you're working on a project, that project is to build out a product or a service. So products and services are there to solve problems which meet the needs of consumers or users, as we like to call them. So imagine like where maybe 50 years in the future, and we've managed to unravel all sorts of amazing things about how our minds work, and we are able to travel telepathically. Like we can just close our eyes and magically turn up wherever we want in the world, right? Just imagine. So if in that world, you're probably not likely to get onto a flight to go from here, Pune, to Australia, to Sydney, for 18, 20 hours, however long it is, because you can be there in an instant, right? You don't have to go through the faff of going through the booking process, packing your bags and all of that. You can just go there, come back whenever you want. So airline services, all those companies like Indigo, Air India, etc., who provide those airline services, they would probably go bust because they're not really solving a problem that really exists anymore. But we might find that other transportation companies like car companies and motorbike companies and maybe bicycles, maybe they are actually still around because they solve slightly different problems. So again, hands up, does anybody here drive on a daily basis? Right, okay. So if you're like me and you drive your car on a daily basis, well, I drive when I'm in Sydney, you probably listen to music as well. And every now and again when you're traveling at speed, you might turn the music up a little bit louder. And then you might actually start singing while the music's turning up a little bit louder. And then when someone zooms past, you sort of pretend like you weren't singing at all, right? So cars are actually awesome mobile karaoke bars. They solve a problem. They keep us entertained. You could also think about like motorbikes. Motorbikes are actually really entertaining as well. When you get onto a motorbike, you tend to go with your friends, you tend to go on long journeys, you tend to see beautiful scenery around you. So it's the whole experience that's actually really lovely. So motorbikes aren't just getting you from A to B, they're actually solving a slightly different problem as well, which is to keep you entertained. And with bicycles, for those people who ride bicycles, certainly in London, it's very much about fitness as well. So, given that products and services only exist to solve problems for us, it's really important for us to make sure that the problems are real problems and they're problems that people actually care about. So one of the greatest thinkers of the last century, this guy, Albert Einstein, he said something about problem solving. He said that if I were given an hour to save the planet, I'd spend 59 minutes defining the problem and then just 1 minute trying to resolve it. So it sounds a little bit excessive. Like for those of us who work on teams, we know that if we took that literally, it would mean that we'd spend an hour, like if we worked on a task that took an hour, it would probably take us like 8 days to analyze and prototype, which sounds a bit excessive. And if, let's say, we were working on a feature that took like a week, then we'd spend a year to analyze and prototype. So we don't need to exactly take it on face value, but the principle is actually really nice, which is that it's a good idea to spend a lot more time understanding the problem rather than solving it. But what does that actually mean in practice? Like everybody talks about, oh, you should understand the problem, fall in love with the problem, but what does that actually mean in terms of the specific things that you can do in your teams? So this is where product thinking comes in, because product thinking is basically about solving the right problems in the most appropriate way. So again, it's about the right problems in the most appropriate way. And the reason why I want to call out these things is because for those of you who do have product owners in their team or a BA in your team, you know that it tends to be the product owner or the BA's responsibility to try to find the right problem, right? They're the ones who go to the business, they go to those annoying meetings and workshops and waste their time trying to come up with what the problem definition is. And then they come back to the team, and the rest of the team, the engineers, sometimes the DevOps engineers, operations people, they then get to figure out how do we solve this problem, and they get to implement the solution. And obviously they have expertise in or you all have expertise in cutting edge technologies and frameworks, and so it makes sense that you get involved in trying to solve that problem. But research shows us time and time again that the best outcomes that we get as product teams or service teams is when there's a shared sense of responsibility. So when our teams are cross-functional, we've got different skilled areas, and we bring in a different perspective because of our different experiences. And another thing that makes a big difference is having that shared sense of ownership, of having a common goal, and that same purpose. Because we're all motivated by having a sense of purpose, every single one of us. No matter how much you like your bonus or you don't like your financial bonus, at the end of the year, it's having a sense of purpose that actually has one of the biggest impacts on how motivated you are and how well you code and you build products and services. But it's obviously not easy, right? We've all worked in those teams where it feels like people are stepping over each other's toes. You don't want to have those awkward conversations. Two people might be doing the same job. So although it's not easy, it's still incredibly rewarding, and there are definitely ways that you can make these cross-functional teams work well. And the other thing is that even if you didn't believe in the whole shared purpose and having a common goal kind of line of thinking, the reality is that the only reason we exist as a team is because there's a problem, and we're solving that problem as a team. So if you don't know what that problem is, you don't know that your product or your service is going to be solving that problem, which means that if that problem is no longer around, you won't have a job. So at the worst case, at least for the sake of your job security, it's worthwhile being interested in the problem. So how do we try to find out what is the right problem? There's a really good anecdote that I'd like to tell you about a well-known lecturer from the Harvard Business School. So he and one of his colleagues, a user researcher, they did some work with McDonald's. So basically, McDonald's wanted to sell more milkshakes. This is many decades ago. They wanted to sell more milkshakes, so what they did is they basically started to interview people. They started to make some reasonable assumptions about why people bought milkshakes. They thought, well, people are going to buy milkshakes because they're thirsty. They're going to buy milkshakes because they want to buy more because maybe there's a sale on, or because they're tastier than somebody else's milkshakes. So that sounds pretty reasonable, right? Sure. I'd buy a milkshake if it was cheaper and it tasted well. But what they found is that they'd bring in the focus groups. So they'd bring in a group of different types of people who would answer questions like, what kind of flavors do you like? And how much would you like to pay for a milkshake? And do you like the texture, or do you want it to be thicker or chunkier or something else? And what they found is that even though they experimented with their product, with the milkshake, nothing changed. They didn't sell any more milkshakes than they did before they started the focus groups. So then this professor came in with his researcher, and they did something called user research. They tried to understand the problem that people were solving by buying milkshakes. So what they did is, one of the guys, he spent 18 hours in a single McDonald's just observing people, just watching them. And he observed things like, what were people wearing? When were they actually buying the milkshake? Was it really early in the day or really late? You know, did they buy other food with the milkshake, or was it just the milkshake? They were only in for the milkshake. And when did they drink the milkshake? Did they drink the milkshake when they were in the McDonald's, or did they wait till they left, till they were on their way to drink the milkshake? And what they found is that 40% of the people who bought milkshakes in an entire day bought them in a very small period of time. They bought them before 8 o'clock in the morning. So it's a very particular time of the day. And they found that every single one of those people, of that 40%, was alone. They were male. Not making any judgments here. And they drove off in their cars. Again, not judging anyone. Alone. So they didn't stay back to drink or to eat or anything like that in the McDonald's. So they then asked the next question, the question we all love, which is, why? What problem were these men who were alone, who were buying just milkshakes and then driving off in their cars, what problem were they actually trying to solve? Like, were they hungry? Were they thirsty? You know, what was actually driving them? And they found that people did not buy milkshakes because they were thirsty or they were hungry. They didn't buy milkshakes because they were hot and they wanted to cool down, and they definitely didn't buy milkshakes because there was a dip in the price, like there was some sort of promotion. What they found is that, as you know, for those of you who've been to the States or watched any Hollywood movie, people drive in cars all the time in the US, and they get stuck in traffic. They drive everywhere, they have these long, boring drives in the morning to work. And when you're waking up in the morning, you're not necessarily completely awake, right? You need something to perk you up. So they found people were getting bored on their drive into work, so they'd stop off and they'd get a milkshake. So people were buying milkshakes as a form of entertainment to keep themselves engaged. Like, who would have thought that that would be a form of entertainment, right? You'd think that you put the radio on, or you'd listen to a podcast. Well, they didn't have podcasts back then, but you know. But it turns out that people wanted to be engaged, and having something there that just sat there next to them as they were driving, lifting it up, taking a sip every now and again, gave them something to do. It kept them engaged with the whole experience. And the other thing was that people weren't necessarily hungry when they got into their car, when they woke up in the morning. But they knew that by the time they got into work, after that long, boring drive, they were going to get hungry. So they didn't want a full meal now. But having something like a milkshake, that's genius. You get to gradually have a meal that gradually keeps you a little bit fuller as you're going along. So by the time you get into work, you're not hungry anymore. So that was the second problem that was being solved. So now that they figured out what problems were being solved by having milkshakes, they were able to figure out how they could improve the sales of milkshakes. So they figured out, well, we could make milkshakes more interesting. If that's a form of entertainment, what are some things that we could do to make milkshakes interesting? Now, has everybody here tried things like sweet and salty popcorn? Yeah? Or like milk, you know how you can get milk chocolate with sea salt flakes in them as well? Yeah? The reason why they're really popular is because when you bite into them, you actually get sensations. You get the sweet chocolate, and then, ooh, there's all of a sudden a difference in the texture, and there's something really interesting with the saltiness of the sea salt flake. And it's the same thing with the sweet and salty popcorn. So well before these sort of products came about, McDonald's then thought, along with the researcher and this professor, well, maybe we could do something with the texture of the milkshake, like if we had fruity chunks in them. People aren't really interested in healthy milkshakes, but they're interested in entertaining milkshakes. So they experimented with adding fruit chunks to their milkshakes. They experimented with like making them thicker. They also looked at trying to make it as easy as possible to buy the milkshake, because people just wanted to get the milkshake and then get out of there. So if people had, let's say, a prepaid card that they could use at a milkshake counter, get their milkshake, and then leave, that was an amazing experience. It's so much simpler. So by experimenting with some of these different solutions, they actually managed to increase the sales of their milkshakes. So what didn't work was asking people what they wanted, or doing what we think is common sense, which is reducing the price of something. And what actually worked was meeting people's needs by solving their problems better. And what was really interesting is that different people had tried to solve the problem in different ways. So some people who were interviewed had said that they tried a banana, but the bananas weren't great because you were hungry by the time you got to work. And somebody else said, oh, I tried to eat a bagel, but bagels are so messy. Like, I'm driving in my car, I have to cut the bagel, use both of my hands to put the cream cheese and the jam, and then I'm steering my car with my knees. It's a total mess. It just doesn't work. So what McDonald's actually ended up learning was that McDonald's milkshakes weren't competing with Wendy's milkshakes and Burger King milkshakes. They were also competing with bananas, bagels, coffee, and Snicker bars. And there is no way that a marketing team could have learnt that by asking people, by doing that the traditional type of focus group-based research. And I think what's really interesting about this kind of pattern is that there are lots of parallels that we experience in our work as well when we work in tech. So, you know, imagine that you're working on an e-commerce site, right? You're building up an e-commerce site. You're going to look at players like Amazon, you're going to look at Flipkart, and you're going to see what they're doing. You're going to see, okay, so this is what their checkout process looks like. These are some of the filters that they have on their search. You know, this is how they advertise some of their products. But the thing is, you don't know what problems Amazon and Flipkart are solving for people. We may think that people are going there just to buy products, but it's a lot more complex than that, because problems have social and emotional dimensions to them. They're not just functional. And unless you know what those problems are, you really can't go about solving them. And the best way to understand what the social and emotional, and to be fair, even the functional aspects of a problem, are to do user research. It's to observe people. It's to do things like usability testing. Now, we all work, well, a lot of us work, I'm sure, in cross-functional teams. And there are a lot of techniques that people who come from a product background, so designers, UX specialists, product owners, business analysts as well, they bring to the table in order to try to understand problems. So you might hear of terms like design thinking, user research, usability testing. And although these are special skills that these people tend to have, it doesn't mean that they're skills that are exclusively for these people. Because as we know, what makes a team work well is when there's a shared level of core skills. Like, everybody loves working with a product owner who actually understands technology. And the flip side is every product owner loves working with a developer who understands product. And in order for us to be able to identify what all these right problems are, we all as a team need to be able to use some of these best practices. So imagine you've used all these best practices, you've managed to define what the right problem is. The next step is you need to figure out how we're going to solve our problem in the most appropriate way. So we've got a room here full of very experienced practitioners. I mean, obviously, you're at least very engaged because you came on a Saturday to a talk on product. Well, I'm sure you aren't here just for my talk, but I'll pretend in my head. But you're here on the weekend, you know, trying to listen or listening to technical talks. So obviously, you're very engaged. Now, I'm sure there's lots of DevOps operations type people and lots of engineers who are here as well. Can I just see a show of hand of who's in DevOps or WebOps or operations? Okay, cool, welcome. And then who would sort of classify themselves as like an engineer or a, yep, okay, right, cool. So, obviously, it's because we are relatively quite technical here, it seems quite obvious that software is the most obvious way for us to solve our problems. But it doesn't necessarily mean it's always the most appropriate way. And even though we are very technical, it doesn't necessarily mean that as technical people, we can't solve problems using non-technical solutions. So I want to give you an example from one of the places where I worked somewhat recently. So it was a very large organization. There were around 500,000 employees, and people moved around a lot internally. So the place had a really strong culture of having like a job for life. So people liked to move around, they'd stay there for decades. And so because of that, the internal job site was really active. People would go to the job site almost on a weekly basis, and they'd look at what kind of jobs are being advertised, they'd recommend jobs to friends, they'd apply for jobs. And so what we wanted to find out is, before we made any improvements to the site, why did people actually apply for jobs internally? So it seems like a pretty obvious question, right? You apply for jobs because you want to change your job. So you might want to make more money. You might want to have more responsibility and learn, or you might want something from somebody else. So we found that a lot of the senior managers were actually motivated by status. So they wanted to get more respect and status in their community, and that's what actually motivated them to look for jobs and change jobs. But we also made some very interesting observations. So we found that there was a fairly large core group of people who were very happy with their jobs. They actually didn't want to change their jobs, but they would go onto that job site on a regular basis and they'd be applying for jobs. So we thought, let's look into this a little bit more and try to find out what this is actually about. So what we did is we followed what's called the 5 whys technique. Many of you may have heard of this. This is something that's been used by Einstein. It's been used by Toyota. It's a very well-known technique that's used for understanding the root causes of problems. So what you do is you basically keep asking why, and you build up a tree of causality. So you build up a tree of the reasons for why things are the way that they are. And so we did our research, we shared it with other digital teams across the organization, and then what we did is we said, okay, let's all just go off and try to see if we can figure out the problem in our own different ways. So some teams went down a very technical route. We decided to not go down a technical route. So you're probably not going to be able to read this, but basically in the hierarchy of problems, what we knew was that people were applying for jobs and they didn't actually want to change their job. So when we asked why, we realized that these people weren't getting good feedback from their managers. So their line managers weren't actually engaging with them and telling them what they were doing well and where they could improve. And the reality is that we all want to learn. And when we asked why again, it turned out there were loads of reasons. You know, in some cases the managers weren't trained, in some cases the managers were quite disengaged, but also the managers just didn't have time. They had a whole lot of other responsibilities that they were focused on. And even if they did have the time, it turned out that in many cases, the managers didn't even know the details of what people were doing on their day-to-day jobs. It turned out the people who worked closest with these applicants were the people who knew them best and who knew best what they were doing well and where they could improve. So we took 2 data points. We took the fact that managers didn't have time and the fact that managers didn't even know what feedback to give. And we said, okay, let's see if we can actually try to get people's peers to give them feedback. And let's try to see if we can actually try to change mindsets. So people want to learn, but they're struggling. So we think that we can probably get a couple of these groups into a cycle of continuous learning, a cycle of continuous improvement. But in order to shift the mindset, you obviously have to work very closely with people. So what we did is we basically shadowed a particular group of people who had applied for jobs, and we went into a number of their team meetings. So we went into meetings where they were running workshops, or they were attending workshops, or they were just having, smaller meetings with other people. And what we did is, 5 minutes before the end of every single one of those meetings, we called a timeout And we asked for everybody who was attending to spend a couple of minutes just writing down on some Post-its, what did they like what went really well in that session, what didn't go quite so well and could be improved in the session, and think about how they individually could contribute to the improvement and how they were responsible for what went really well. So it was basically getting people to reflect on their own behaviors, but also observe other people's behaviors. And what we found is that after a couple of weeks, people started to do this by themselves. So we didn't have to actually ask them. In the middle of a meeting, someone might make a really good point, and someone would say, "That's a fantastic point. You were really concise in conveying that point. That's amazing." So it starts to get really meta. People also then started to email each other and give positive feedback and suggestions for improvements. So although we didn't expect to, we found that there were some unexpected benefits, like there was increased trust in the teams. People were starting to have more honest and difficult conversations, which also increased the team morale. And although we didn't run a controlled experiment, we didn't try to see if a digital solution could have achieved the same outcomes, it was pretty clear that we got some pretty phenomenal results by not using a single piece of tech. And this was because we understood the social and the emotional aspects of the problem. Not everything is about doing something functional. And when we looked at what some of the other digital teams were doing in the organization, so some of the teams had implemented a 360-degree feedback tool. And if any of you have used 360-degree feedback tools, you know that they are incredibly clunky, they're incredibly painful, and nobody uses them. Some other people had set up some free questionnaires, and they'd sent them out to people, just as little links in their footers, and they'd pointed their friends or their colleagues to provide them with feedback. And yes, some of them did get some really good feedback, but the results weren't quite as astounding as what we found through the work that we did. So as a team, our responsibility is to solve the right problem in the most appropriate way. And so to do that, we need to draw on a really broad set of skills to identify the problem together and solve it in the best way that we can. And that's not to say that developers have to become designers and BAs have to become HR people and finance people have to become product owners. But it does mean that as we start to learn a little bit more from each other's specialities, we actually get better at our own jobs and in our own specialism. And it also means that if we're more open to bringing other people into our team, depending on the need of the project or the problem that we're trying to solve, we get a much better solution and much better engagement across the team. So what are some practical things that we can actually do in order to bring product thinking into our teams? Let's start with day one on the job. So imagine you've moved projects and you started in a new company. So you're excited, you're motivated, you're meeting new people, right? You want to play around with some new framework or do some spikes on some sort of new technology. And you're met with this problem. How can I run my first test case really quickly? And I've crossed out line of code because everybody here is practicing TDD, right? So what do you have to do? You have to get your laptop, you have to set up accounts, you have to get tools installed on your laptop, you have to get access to the right service, you have to have ports opened, you have to raise numerous service tickets, you have to get approvals from people in this organization you don't even know to say that yes, you can do these little things, and then somebody else has to do something else. So you end up being really frustrated, really demotivated, and you haven't been productive. It's not the best start to any new project. And in the worst case that I saw in a particular client, it ended up taking 2.5 months for a new developer to write their first line of code. Obviously, in that organization, they were not practicing TDD, so it was the first line of code. So what would happen if we actually treated everybody as a user? If we treated each of our colleagues as a user, we would all have very different experiences. So I've heard about some great things that colleagues over at ExpertTalks, but then even ex-colleagues of mine in other organizations, they've tried to make the onboarding experience much easier for their colleagues. So they've done things like they've written scripts so that the onboarding experience just requires running 2 or 3 commands and boom, you've got everything set up on your local. And that, in one particular example, actually, it ended up taking the setup time from a day to 20 minutes. So the person came in, they were able to set up their machine, go off, get a coffee, do their onboarding, and then they were writing their first line of code and deploying straight away, which is amazing. And there are other people who are starting to look at this problem. Like some of you may have heard of Vagrant. So Vagrant is a tool for building and managing virtual machine environments. And it's not just for developers, it's also for operations people and for designers. And even DevOps, right? Jargon bingo. The DevOps movement is actually largely about treating operations colleagues as users, right? It's about making sure that when we build products, they can actually be monitored, that they can be maintained, that they can be improved upon repeatedly. So while we're on the topic of users, does this sound familiar to anyone? It's a user issue, right? Yeah. Especially those of you who've worked in service desk like I have, or who work in operations. People will do the craziest things. But I actually find this statement is a little bit toxic. One of the projects that I worked on was it was an identity and access management platform, incredibly sexy. And what we had was we had a registration process for certain products, for learning products. And when I joined the team, one of the first things that I was kind of faced with was a session with the customer support staff. So they were kind of talking about the problems that they were facing. And they brought some numbers to me, and it seemed like a really high number of people, a really high number of customers or users were calling the support staff, and they were new. So they were really new. They just registered, and they called up almost straight away to reset their passwords. And we thought that's really strange behavior, because if you're new and you've just set up your account, you should just be able to go straight into your product, right? People who need their passwords reset generally have forgotten their passwords because they haven't logged in for a long time. So we went around, we had a look at the registration process, and to us it seemed pretty straightforward. We couldn't understand what the problem was. So we could have said, it's a user issue. You know, we've got some special people out there, let's just put that on the side. Or we could have done some user research. So we found certain users who were having the problem, and we actually sat down next to them and we observed them. And what we found is, so what we originally thought was that people would get onto their machine, they'd do the registration process, they'd try to get in, they'd fail, so then they'd call up the service center and get like really frustrated. What we found, however, was that people were registering not just on their laptops or their desktops, but also on their mobile devices. That's not something that we expected. And then after they'd registered, they'd go, after they accessed the registration page, they'd go to the registration screens and they'd click through. And what was happening was that on the very last page of the registration screen, there's a page that kind of says, oh, congratulations, you know, welcome to blah, you know, we really hope you enjoy using the product, etc. At the bottom of the screen, there's a little button to say, okay, just okay. And because people were using mobile devices and we had a really crappy responsive framework that we were using, no one could see that button. It was below the fold. And even on the machines that they were using, again, because of our really crappy responsive framework, no one could see the button on the dimension, on the resolution of their screens, which were not resolutions that we cater for. So what we found is that people would get to the last page, they wouldn't see the button, they wouldn't click, and what would happen is their account would be half set up. Then they'd try to log in, they wouldn't be able to log in, then they'd click the reset password button, they wouldn't be able to reset the password, then they'd call the service desk. So what we did is we ended up having a look at the responsive framework that we were using. We fixed that issue. We also had a look at the content that we had on the registration pages and the workflow on the registration pages, and we drastically reduced it. So instead of having to click through to 5 pages, they were clicking through to 2 pages, and once they'd registered, there was no confirmation button to confirm that they'd actually registered. So we subscribed to the idea that there's no such thing as a bad user, only bad design. And this proves itself true time and time again. I mean, you will get into certain situations where there really is a very niche type of user, but it always helps actually starting from the point that the problem is not with the user and the problem is with the design. And why this is, I think, particularly important is because if you think about it, people spend more time on products that are not your product. even if you work on Google search, people are spending more time calling cars via Uber, you know, shopping online, reading blogs, going on Twitter, using various other types of digital products. But they spend a lot more time on those products than they do on your product. So they already have expectations about how your product should work based on their cumulative experiences. So if you set up an e-commerce site and you put the shopping basket in the bottom left-hand corner, no one's going to buy a product from you. You always expect it in the top right-hand corner. So that's why it's really important for us to understand what the expectations are of our users. And that's where dog fooding comes in. So just as a show of hands, who's heard of dog fooding or who practices dog fooding? Yep, okay, cool. Dog fooding can be really useful. It's basically the practice of using your own product so you get to see what it's like for other people. But the problem is you're not like other people. It's your product, so you're an expert in using your product. So you are going to use your product in a way in which no one else out there is going to use it. So if you do dog food, great, but also make sure you do proper user research or proper testing of your product with other users so that you can actually validate what you don't know. And this is the other point. When you actually look at the digital literacy across the world, we in this room are amongst less than the 5 to 8% actually, based on the latest figures. So because we know how to send emails and we go much further than that and we can code and write tests and etc., we're actually incredibly proficient at using digital tools. However, our users are not like that, mostly. Even our technical users, even if, let's say, you're a developer and you're building an application and you want operations to support that application, right? Or you've built an API and you want another developer to use your API. Time and time again, research shows that even when you use language that you think is quite common in your industry, other people in your industry don't understand it. And the reason is that not everybody has had the same experience as you. You've got you've got junior developers, you've got senior people, you've got people who come from an enterprise background, people who come from an agile background. And because of all of this diversity, we don't even have a common shared language. So it's always worthwhile testing everything we do, even when they're technical products. So we should validate our assumptions as we go. And the best way, some of the best ways to do this is to do user research, as I mentioned, is to prototype, put things in front of people. Yes, even if it's API documentation, get a developer to read it and see if they know how to actually invoke your API. And there's really cool things, like you could use experiment boards. I know a lot of people who sort of subscribe to lean thinking, lean startup thinking, they love using experiment boards, and they can be a lot of fun as well. You can kind of gamify the process of trying to deliver software. So, don't assume, because we always make mistakes when we actually start to assume. And the other thing, the last thing that I wanted to mention was around the problem. So I mentioned earlier on about how Albert Einstein recommended spending more time learning about the problem than actually solving it. So apart from like the user research and the prototyping, you know, you can speak to people, ask people what they need, and follow usability best practices. So if we treat everybody as a user, if we assume there's no bad users and any bad design, if we don't make assumptions, and if we try to spend more time on understanding the problem, we're on a really good path towards applying product thinking in our projects. And I threw a lot of sort of buzzwords in today. So if you wanted to ignore all of the buzzwords and you just wanted to take one practical activity to put into your daily practice or into your weekly practice, I would recommend it's this thing in the middle. Sit with your users for an hour every single fortnight, and you will learn so much more than reading any book or going to any talk, even if it's this talk. There's absolutely no substitute for user research. And that's it. Cool. So, is there time for questions? Yeah, okay. Does anyone have any questions? It was that fascinating, huh? All right. Oh, yeah?
Okay, Neha, so what do you propose for engineers who are anyway geographically far distant
from your users? Okay, well,
so should the product management phase, what's your thought?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's essentially the responsibility of the product or design or user experience person to make sure that the entire team is engaged in that experience. So there's loads of great ways in which you can do remote connecting and remote streaming into user research sessions. Also, a pretty common practice is to actually record user research sessions and then debrief with the team. So like with one of my teams, what we would do is, like, where you don't have a lab, obviously, what you could do is you record the session, you know, of the user on your laptop trying to use your product, whatever it is. So you capture what their face is doing at every point, and you also capture what they're doing on the screen. Then you share that video with the whole team. Then you come back as a team, and you just spend an hour talking through what your observations were. And as a team, you can prioritize the problems that you saw and potential solutions as well to address those problems. But the power of that is that when you actually have a consistent understanding of the problem, you end up having, like, obviously a lot more innovative solutions for that problem. And some of the best ideas come from technical people. It's just a shame that we don't expose them to the actual problem. Does that answer the question? Yep, okay. I think we're out of time. Okay, cool. Time for one more question. That was me, sorry. Okay. I think that's a wrap. Cool. Thanks.
Thanks, Neha.